The chandelier inside the Whitmore mansion sparkled like a crown, pouring golden light across polished marble floors. Expensive paintings lined the hallways, works by famous artists worth more than most homes. Upstairs, laughter echoed from. The gallery is Manhattan's richest gathered in gowns and tuxedos. But downstairs, away from the noise and champagne, a woman in a faded uniform quietly wiped fingerprints off a staircase railing. Her name was Elena. She'd worked here for nearly 20 years. Her hands moved with care, knowing every corner of the house better than its owner did. No one noticed her except when she was needed. What no one in that glittering mansion knew was that Elena's hands didn't just clean. Once, long ago, they had created paintings that brought people to tears. Her fingers had mixed colors that told stories. Her brushstrokes had captured sunlight, sorrow, and memory. But tonight, someone was about to take her most personal piece of art and turn it into a joke. The front doors swung open with force. Richard Whitmore, the billionaire host, entered with his usual loud voice and smug smile. His designer suit looked untouched by time, and behind him followed a trail of wealthy guests, art dealers, socialites, hedge fund managers. Everyone was dressed to impress. The evening's charity auction had been a big success, and Richard walked like a king who had just won a war. "Elena," he called across the foyer, not caring that his voice echoed like thunder. "Champagne in the gallery, Dom Perignon. Not that cheap stuff you people drink." She nodded silently and made her way toward the wine cellar. She'd heard worse from him, much worse. He liked to talk big when he was surrounded by guests, showing off his wealth, his collection, his power. Elena said nothing, but her eyes were sharper than anyone knew. She had once stood in galleries bigger than this mansion, where people clapped for her paintings and asked for autographs. But that life felt far away now. Upstairs, the guests gathered in the private gallery. Richard loved this room more than any other. It was where he kept his most expensive art. Monets, Picassos, sketches and paintings with names that impressed people. Each piece had a story, and Richard loved to tell them. But tonight, he had something else to show, something that would make his guests laugh. "And here," Richard said, waving dramatically toward a corner of the room, "we have what I call accidental art." Everyone turned. Leaning against the wall was a small painting, soft, colorful, full of light. It showed a coastline, waves crashing against golden cliffs, boats rocking gently near a harbor. It was beautiful, alive. It looked like it belonged in a museum. But Richard wasn't done. "My maid painted this during her break yesterday," he said with a cruel laugh. Can you imagine? The help thinking they can create art? A few people chuckled politely. Some shifted uncomfortably. One woman raised an eyebrow. A man in a tailored suit squinted at the painting, his eyes narrowing as he examined the brushstrokes. Richard kept going. "Next thing you know, she'd be asking for a gallery opening. Maybe I'll hang this in the guest bathroom. Or better yet, throw it out with tomorrow's trash." He reached for the canvas, his fingers smudging the paint as he picked it up carelessly. The laughter faded a bit. One guest, James Morrison, a known investor in the art world, tilted his head slightly. He didn't laugh. Instead, he took out his phone and snapped a quiet photo. From the hallway, unseen by the crowd, Elena stood still. She'd been polishing silver nearby. She heard every word. She saw Richard touch her painting like it was nothing. Her heart didn't race. This wasn't the first time he embarrassed her, but something inside her shifted. The memory of that painting was still fresh. It had come from her soul, from a place full of love and longing. What Richard didn't. No, what none of the guests knew was that Elena's full name wasn't just Elena. It was once known across Europe. Elena Vasquez, youngest professor ever at a prestigious French art school, praised by critics, collected by galleries, loved by the public until her husband got sick, until life asked her to choose between fame and family. And she chose love. In her pocket, her phone buzzed. A new message had arrived. From a name she hadn't seen in years, the Guggenheim Museum. She didn't open it yet. She simply turned. back down the hall and returned to the kitchen. The party was still going, the laughter was still echoing, and her painting? Still leaning in the corner, but by tomorrow, everything was going to change. The guests returned to sipping champagne and admiring the million-dollar artworks, but one man remained focused on the small painting in the corner. James Morrison didn't laugh like the others. He leaned in closer, examining the brushstrokes, the texture, the control of light. Something about it pulled at his memory like a name he couldn't quite remember. He quietly saved the photo and stepped away, deep in thought. Downstairs, Elena poured champagne into crystal flutes with hands that remembered how to hold a brush. She moved through the kitchen with practiced grace, but her mind wasn't in that mansion anymore. It was drifting through memories, sunlit galleries, crowded openings, the smell of fresh paint, the sound of applause. Her name once carried weight, Elena Vasquez. She had taught at the Beaux-Arts in Paris before most of these people had learned to pronounce Monet, but art didn't pay hospital bills. And when her husband, Miguel, was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's at just 45, dreams had to be set aside. They had tried everything, selling her studio, auctioning old works, leaning on contacts who owed her favors. Nothing had been enough. The treatments Miguel needed weren't covered by insurance. The cost? $200,000 a year. It was a number that never left her mind. Even now, as she stacked empty trays in the butler's pantry, the number echoed like a whisper. 200,000. That night, when the guests were gone and the marble halls fell silent again, Elena climbed the narrow stairs to her small apartment above. A queen's bodega. Her daughter Sophia was already asleep, her textbook spread across the kitchen table. Elena moved quietly, slipped out of her uniform, and pulled a canvas from beneath her bed. She painted every night, not for money, not for fame, but because she needed to. Painting was the only thing that made her feel whole. The landscape Richard had mocked was from memory a place she and Miguel had visited during their honeymoon in Barcelona. Back when life was wide open. Back when he remembered her name without having to be reminded. She had sent a photo of the painting to an old friend in the museum, whirled earlier that week, not for sale. Just to share, to say, I still exist. She hadn't expected a reply, but now there was a message waiting on her phone. From someone she never thought she'd hear from again. She opened it slowly. The words made her hands tremble. Is this you, Elena? It looks like your light work. If it is, we need to talk. Catherine, Dr. Catherine Wells, Senior Curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, a name that once introduced Elena at shows. A friend, a believer, someone who had written about Elena's emotional luminescence, the way her paintings captured more than just color, they captured feeling. She had spent years trying to find out why Elena disappeared. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Could she answer? Could she go back to that world after all this time? The next morning, the Whitmore mansion buzzed with activity again. Elena arrived at 6 a.m., as always, dressed in her plain uniform and worn shoes. Richard was already pacing the hallway, barking into his Bluetooth headset. Something about investors, deadlines, and idiots who can't close a deal. When he saw Elena, he didn't greet her. He never did. He simply waved his hand at the dining room. Fresh orchids. And make sure the silverware gleams. I've got guests coming. Real guests, this time art collectors who know the difference between brilliance and broom closets. He laughed at his own joke. Elena smiled politely and headed to the flower fridge. You didn't throw out that silly painting, did you? He called after her. I placed it in storage, sir. She replied calmly. Double quotes good. Bring it out again this afternoon, he said, sipping coffee from a gold-trimmed cup. I want them to see it. It'll help them appreciate the real art I own. Elena said nothing, but inside her heart was steady now. Something had changed. Not just in the air, but in her. By noon, the mansion was being cleaned for another round of elite visitors. Margaret Ashford, a regular at Richard's events, had invited a few friends from the art world for a private tour. Richard had no idea who they really were, One of them was Catherine Wells, the same Catherine who had stared at the photo James Morrison sent her the night before. The moment she saw the brushwork, she knew. She had stayed up all night flipping through old catalogs and exhibition posters. Pulling up her archived notes from 2 decades ago, there was no doubt in her mind. Elena Vasquez, missing for over 20 years, was alive and quietly working as a maid in a billionaire's home. And the painting Richard laughed at? It wasn't a joke, it was a masterpiece. Catherine's message had been short, but it was only the beginning. The Whitmore mansion had been cleaned from top to bottom, polished to reflect Richard's pride. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, making the marble floors glow like glass. Fresh orchids stood in crystal vases. The paintings in the private gallery had been dusted and adjusted just right, each with small lights above them to highlight their value. Richard liked perfection, especially when he was showing off. At exactly 2 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Elena opened the door silently and stepped back as the guests walked in. Margaret Ashford, dressed in pearls and expensive perfume, led the way. Her heels tapped softly against the floor. Behind her came 2 women and a man, all sharply dressed. The last guest to enter wore a tailored gray suit and carried a leather portfolio. Her hair was pulled back and her glasses sat neatly on her nose. She looked calm, professional, but her eyes scanned the room with purpose. Catherine Wells. She didn't smile when Richard welcomed them. She simply nodded and followed the group inside. "Welcome, everyone," Richard said, stretching his arms wide. "Today you'll see what a real collection looks like. Original pieces, no reproductions here. Some of these are worth more than your homes." Margaret gave a polite chuckle, but Catherine didn't respond. She was looking around slowly, scanning the walls. She didn't care about the price tags. She was searching for something else. As the group entered the private gallery, Richard stood proudly in front of his Degas pastel and waved a hand at the row of priceless art. "Every piece has a story," he began, slipping into his usual monologue. "This one came from an estate in Switzerland. That one private auction in Geneva. You won't find work like this in ordinary homes." Then he motioned toward the easel near the corner. Elena's painting had been placed back in the spotlight, just as he promised. The Mediterranean scene looked different today, more alive under the soft lights, as if the painting itself knew it was finally being seen. "And now," Richard said with a smirk, "for the most amusing part of our little tour. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present the help's attempt at creativity." The room fell silent. He didn't notice. This was painted by my maid during her break. No training, no education, just a cleaning rag in one hand and a brush in the other. "It's cute, don't you think? Like a child's doodle left in a museum." Margaret's smile froze. The man beside her shifted awkwardly. One of the women narrowed her eyes. Catherine said nothing. She walked closer to the painting and stood very still. Richard laughed, not sensing the change in energy. "Don't worry, I didn't pay for it. I found her painting it behind the kitchen. Honestly, it would make a good story for cocktail hour." The maid who thought she could be Monet. Still, no one laughed. Catherine stepped even closer. She adjusted her glasses and tilted her head. Her fingers brushed the air just above the canvas, never touching it, but tracing the texture, the movement, the light. Elena stood near the doorway, pretending to polish a tray, her eyes locked on Catherine. She could see the change in her posture, the way her breath slowed. She recognized that look. Recognition, shock, belief. "Mr. Whitmore," Catherine said quietly. "May I ask when this piece was created?" Richard chuckled. "Oh, just a day or 2 ago. Why? Planning to bid on it?" "No," Catherine said, her voice cool and measured. "I'd just like to know a bit more about the artist." "Your employee. Her full name?" Richard waved a hand carelessly. "Elena something. I don't know, Vasquez, I think? She's been here for years." Silence. Catherine opened her leather portfolio and slowly pulled out a small, worn exhibition catalog. On the cover was a painting, sunlight through trees, and beneath it, a name printed in bold white letters. "Elena Vasquez, Light and Memory, a retrospective. Richard blinked, confused. Wait, what is this? Catherine didn't answer him. She turned the catalog toward the guests, showing them the artist's photo. It was Elena, 20 years younger, standing with a paintbrush in one hand, a canvas behind her, and a calm strength in her eyes. A quote below the photo read, "A visionary voice in modern impressionism." The New York Times' James Morrison, who had quietly entered just minutes earlier, leaned in to look. Catherine's voice was firm now. "Mr. Whitmore, this is not a joke. This is not a maid's doodle. This is the work of Elena Vasquez, one of the most gifted impressionist painters of her generation." The silence was sharp. Richard's face paled. "That can't be. She cleans the rooms." "She also taught at the Sorbonne," Catherine said. "Her paintings hang in museums across Europe. I've spent 15 years trying to find her." James stepped forward. "Catherine, are you sure?" "I'm not guessing," she said. "I wrote my doctoral thesis on her work." Elena felt the room shift. Everyone was looking at her now. Not as a cleaner, but as someone entirely new, or maybe as who she really was all along. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. He glanced at the painting, then back at Elena. The joke was gone. The smirk vanished. He was finally realizing the truth. The room stood still. Even the chandelier seemed to stop its gentle sway. Richard's voice, always so loud and sure, had vanished. For the first time in a long time, he looked small, uncertain, like someone who had misread the moment, and now everyone was watching him realize that Catherine Wells didn't rush. She placed the old exhibition catalog gently on the glass coffee table, her fingers smoothing the worn cover as if it were sacred. Then she stepped away from the painting and looked directly at Elena. "Elena Vasquez," she said softly, but with clarity. "Please, would you join us?" Every head turned. Elena, standing by the doorway with a silver tray in hand, looked frozen. The guests stared not with mockery now, but with curiosity, confusion, and something close to respect. Even Margaret. Ashford lowered her eyes, ashamed of the laughter from the night before. Elena didn't move at first. She felt the floor beneath her, the walls around her, the years that had buried her name. Her hands trembled slightly, not with fear, but with something older like an earthquake starting deep inside. Then she placed the tray on a side table, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the painting. She didn't need to speak. Her presence said enough. Catherine turned to the guests. Elena Vasquez was one of the most influential impressionist painters of the late 20th century. Her use of light, her emotional layering, her color techniques, they were considered groundbreaking. Her last exhibition was in 2002, after which she disappeared completely from the art world. We didn't know what happened. Some thought she had died. Others believed she had simply retired. Richard cleared his throat, trying to collect himself. "There must be some mistake," he said, though his voice lacked its usual weight. "I mean, she never said anything." "She's been my maid for years. She had no reason to tell you." Catherine replied firmly. "You never asked. You saw a uniform, not a person." James Morrison stepped closer to the painting and looked again. "You said she painted this yesterday?" Richard nodded, confused. "Yes, I caught her painting it behind the kitchen." Morrison ran a hand over his jaw. "The brushwork? It's better than some of her earlier pieces. There's evolution here. A maturity in the palette, a control of emotion. I thought it looked familiar, but I wasn't sure. Now I am." Catherine turned back to Elena. "Is this your work?" Elena's voice, when it came, was quiet, steady. "Yes." That one word landed like thunder. The woman who had dusted these halls, scrubbed these floors, picked up after these guests, had just claimed a painting. That might be worth more than everything hanging in Richard's gallery. A beat passed. Then Catherine opened her leather portfolio again, pulling out old auction records, gallery reviews, and printed articles. She held them up one by one, Elena's work sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars before she vanished. This painting, she pointed to the canvas Richard had mocked, shows the same hand. The same mastery of light and space. The same initials in the bottom right corner. Elena Vasquez Cardenas. Margaret Ashford gasped softly. It's true. I remember those initials. From that show at the Tate, I thought, that artist was French? She studied in Paris. Catherine corrected. But she's from here. And she's been here, hiding in plain sight. Richard's face had gone pale. But why? Why would someone like her work here? As a maid? Elena looked at him for the first time, and her gaze was steady. Because art didn't pay for my husband's treatment. Because hospitals don't accept praise from critics as payment. Because my daughter needed school books, not museum openings. That's why. Richard tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Around him, his guests had changed. They weren't admiring his Monet anymore. They were staring at the one painting he'd wanted to throw in the trash. Catherine stepped forward. Mr. Whitmore, I hope you understand the mistake you made. This is not about embarrassment. This is about value, talent, dignity. You treated a world-class artist like she was invisible. I didn't know, he muttered, shaken. I swear. I didn't know. You never asked, Catherine said again. You were too busy showing off. Elena stood quietly by her painting, hands folded in front of her, her eyes on the floor. She wasn't angry. She had let go of anger a long time ago. What filled her now was something deeper relief. Not because her name had been spoken again, but because the truth had been seen. Finally, Catherine glanced at the other guests. This painting, if it were to go to auction today, it could start at $200,000. Possibly more. Gasps spread around the room. James Morrison nodded slowly. I'd be interested in making an offer. Richard's mouth dropped open. You can't be serious. I'm very serious, Morrison replied. You should have known what you had, but you didn't. Margaret stepped forward. Elena, she said gently. I'm sorry. Truly. We were wrong to laugh. Elena gave a soft nod. I didn't paint it for them. I painted it for my husband, for myself. And that was the moment Richard finally understood. Not just what he had missed, but what he had crushed under his pride for so long. Greatness had been dusting his stairs, washing his dishes, walking past his trophies unnoticed. And now she had been seen. No one in the room said a word. The silence had a strange weight, like the moment before a storm, when the air holds its breath. Richard stood frozen, still staring at the painting he had once joked about throwing in the trash. The same canvas now had collectors murmuring, curators studying it, and art historians estimating its worth, and standing quietly beside it was the maid he'd ordered around for years. He tried to laugh, tried to break the tension. Look, maybe I was a bit rough. I didn't mean anything personal. It was just a joke, really. James Morrison looked at him sharply. A joke? You smeared your fingers across a work worth over $200,000. You mocked her in front of a room full of guests. Catherine folded her arms. Let's not forget, Richard, this isn't just about one painting. You've humiliated her for years, and now you're standing in the presence of a master, and you don't even recognize the value. Elena said nothing. She didn't need to. Catherine turned to her with soft eyes. You don't have to do this anymore, Elena. You don't have to live small, hidden. You don't owe anyone silence. For a moment, Elena hesitated. Years of invisibility don't fall off easily. She had grown used to quiet hallways and quiet meals. Her voice, once strong in lecture halls and galleries, had shrunk behind cleaning gloves and polite nods. But now, something deep inside her stirred something familiar. Elena looked at Catherine and spoke, her voice calm but clear. I never stopped painting. I just stopped being seen. Catherine smiled, then reached into her bag again and pulled out sealed envelope. The Metropolitan Museum would like to change that. We want to offer you a visiting master artist position. Full-time with full health benefits. You'll have access to our conservation labs, exhibition space, and anything. You need to return to your work." The words fell like sunlight breaking through clouds. Richard blinked. "Wait, you're offering her a job? Like a real one?" Catherine turned slowly. "A position your own guests would kill for." Richard's face twisted slightly. Panic flickered behind his carefully combed hair. This wasn't just embarrassing. Anymore, it was dangerous. Word would get out. People would know he'd mocked a celebrated artist in his own home. Sponsors, collectors, even board members might start questioning his taste, his ethics, his entire brand. He forced a tight smile. "Well, we could work something out, can't we, Elena? I mean, we've known each other for years. You're practically family here." Elena turned to him, her face calm, eyes unreadable. "I clean your toilets, Richard. You've never once asked how I'm doing, not once." He stepped forward, hands slightly raised. "I could offer you more. A raise, better conditions. My guest house. Anything." James scoffed. Now he remembers her name. Elena took a breath, then shook her head. "No, thank you. I believe Dr. Wells has already made me a better offer." Few people clapped quietly. Not to be rude, but because they knew the weight of that moment. Because they had seen the balance shift. Margaret Ashford stepped forward, visibly embarrassed. "Elena, Professor Vasquez, I don't think any of you realize who you truly were. I hope we didn't hurt you too deeply." Elena's gaze softened. "You didn't hurt me. Life already did that. You just reminded me that I'm still standing." Catherine stepped beside her. "You're not just standing, Elena. You're rising again." Then she turned to the group. "We're planning a retrospective. A full exhibition of Elena's early and recent works. The hidden years, we're calling them. We'd like to feature this piece," she nodded toward the painting, "as the centerpiece." James Morrison nodded slowly. "I'd like to make an opening offer. $275,000. The room gasped. Richard's jaw dropped. "Are you kidding me?" James turned to him. "You really don't understand art at all, do you?" Margaret placed a gentle hand on Elena's arm. "If there's anything I can do to support your exhibition, I'd be honored." Richard's phone buzzed, again and again. He checked it. Texts, missed calls. News was spreading. Fast. Someone had leaked the story. Billionaire mocks Maid, turns out she's a lost art legend. Mansion humiliation ends in artistic revenge. Cleaner or creator? The Elena Vasquez revelation. He scrolled in disbelief as dozens of messages flooded in. One from his charity board, another from an investor, a third from a local reporter, and all asking the same thing. Is it true? The color drained from his face. Elena, meanwhile, stood taller than she had in years. Catherine leaned toward her and spoke softly. "I'll have my team send a contract tonight. You'll have a new place, proper care for your husband, and your daughter's education fully supported." Elena nodded slowly, a tear catching in her eye. Not from sadness, but from something older. Hope, Sophia's tuition, Miguel's medicine. The paint, the canvas, the light, all of it had finally found a place again. Behind her, Richard stumbled back into his office, and for the first time ever, the quiet maid didn't follow. The next morning, sunlight poured through the windows of a very different Whitmore mansion. The halls that once held quiet power now echoed with footsteps, not of staff but of reporters. Outside, a small crowd had gathered beyond the tall black gates, their phones raised, their voices whispering the name the world had suddenly remembered, Elena Vasquez. Inside, Richard stood in his office, gripping the edge of his desk with both hands. His phone buzzed every few minutes, calls he no longer wanted to answer. His inbox was flooded. Not with praise, not with new business opportunities, but with statements to clarify, resignations to consider, and media requests he didn't know. How to handle. The front page of the Times showed a grainy photo taken the day before. Richard's mansion. A spotlight shining on a small painting in the corner. And right beside it, Elena, still in her maid uniform, her head high. Her name printed in bold letters above. The lost genius of Elena Vasquez, found in a billionaire's kitchen. Inside the article, journalists had written every detail. Catherine had confirmed Elena's career, her awards, her disappearance, the illness of her husband, her years working as domestic help to survive. And Richard Whitmore, the billionaire who had mocked her, now seen as a man so blind to true talent that he became the story's villain. Meanwhile, just a few miles away, Elena stood in front of a mirror in a small apartment she no longer had to live in. Her hair was pulled back, her blouse freshly pressed. She looked different, not because of her clothes, but because of her eyes. They were clear now, steady, focused. Sophia, her daughter, rushed around their kitchen, folding papers into a leather bag. "Mama, the driver's here from the museum," Elena smiled. One moment, she took one last look at her small apartment. The walls were still hung with her work on framed canvases, painted at night while Miguel slept. Paintings that once felt like secrets. Now they were invitations. Sophia grabbed her mother's hand. "I still can't believe this. You're going to be teaching at the Met, teaching. And they want to buy your work?" Elena nodded, eyes glistening. "Yes, and not just one painting. Catherine wants to show them all, even the ones from the last 20 years. Sophia's voice dropped. "Will it be enough for Dad's treatment?" Elena looked down, then back up. "It's more than enough." They stepped outside where a sleek black car waited. A museum staff member held the door open, smiling warmly. "Professor Vasquez, welcome. The gallery team's already preparing the first room for your retrospective." Sophia beamed. "Told you people still remembered." As the car pulled away, from Queens and toward Manhattan, Elena watched the streets fly past. Not long ago, she had walked these sidewalks carrying groceries after cleaning bathrooms. Now she was going back not as a helper, but as a name. Inside the Metropolitan Museum, the buzz had already begun. Curators were preparing signage. Old press clippings were being restored. Elena's past exhibitions were being reprinted for the opening display. The title of the show, Light in Darkness, The Hidden Years of Elena Vasquez. Catherine Wells stood beside her as she walked into the gallery space. "This is your moment, Elena, and it's only the beginning." Elena didn't respond right away. Her eyes had landed on her painting, the one Richard had mocked. It now stood on a pedestal, lit softly from above. A small gold placard beneath it read, "Mediterranean Dream 2024. Painted in silence, now seen by the world. Donated by James Morrison. Estimated value, $275,000. Elena whispered. "He offered to buy it." Catherine smiled. "He did. But he said it belonged here, and I agree." Back at the mansion, Richard watched the news from his now empty gallery. A voice on the TV announced, "Major collectors are bidding for access to Elena's private collection. The Met will host her teaching workshops beginning next month. She's expected to become one of the most celebrated living artists by the year's end." Richard's collection meant nothing now. No one wanted to tour it. No one wanted his opinion. He had built a reputation as a man of taste. But in the end, he hadn't recognized greatness. Sitting right under his roof scrubbing his marble floors, his staff was leaving. His charity boards had asked him to step down. Investors were pulling out of deals. The Whitmore name, once a golden ticket, had become a symbol of arrogance and blindness. He poured himself a drink. No toast. Just silence. Meanwhile, Elena stood in front of her easel at the museum's private studio. A blank canvas waited in front of her. Sophia sat nearby, scrolling through articles on her laptop. "Mama," she said softly, "they want to interview you, CNN, BBC, The New Yorker, everyone." Elena dipped her brush into paint. "They'll have to wait. I've already given them the story." Sophia laughed. Then what are you doing now? Elena smiled as she lifted the brush, writing the next one. She made the first stroke and the colors came alive again. 6 months later, the line outside the Metropolitan Museum of Art stretched around the block. Visitors stood patiently, some holding program booklets, others checking the time nervously, hoping they'd get inside before the gallery closed for the evening. Art students clutched notebooks. Tourists adjusted their phones to snap photos of the towering poster above the museum's grand steps. It showed a Mediterranean seascape under golden light calm. Stunning, alive. Beneath it, bold letters read, Light and Darkness, the hidden years of Elena Vasquez, now on view. Limited engagement. Inside the gallery, the energy was soft but electric. People moved slowly from one painting to the next, whispering, pointing, staring. There were early works from Paris, bright and technical. Mid-career pieces full of stormy color and grief. And then the hidden years. These paintings had a different feel. Less polished, but deeper. Raw, human, soulful. One of the docents leaned toward a group of visitors. These were painted in a small apartment in Queens. She used leftover canvas, sometimes just cardboard. She didn't even have proper lighting, just a table lamp and memory. Near the center of the gallery, on its own platform, stood the painting that started it all. The one Richard Whitmore had laughed at. The one Elena had created during a quiet night after scrubbing marble floors and folding tablecloths. A museum-grade spotlight cast a warm glow over the canvas. The placard read, Mediterranean Dream, 2024, painted in obscurity, discovered in a billionaire's mansion, now part of history. On loan from the private collection of Dr. Catherine Wells. Auction value, $275,000. Elena stood a few steps away, dressed in a dark blue blouse and soft cream jacket. No uniform, no badge, just herself. Sophia stood beside her, proudly introducing her mother to guests, donors, curators. She had started graduate school in art history, fully funded. Her research focus? Forgotten female artists of the 21st century. The first name on her thesis? Elena Vasquez. In another corner of the room, Catherine Wells gave a press statement to a group of journalists. What Elena's story reminds us, she said, is that genius doesn't wear a label. It doesn't always come wrapped in wealth or social status. Sometimes it walks past us in silence, waiting to be seen. Miguel, Elena's husband, now in a world-class care facility with access to the best experimental treatment, was not present, but his photo sat quietly on a small table near the guest book, beside a hand-painted card, for Miguel. My first and forever muse. People left flowers there, letters, sketches, notes, back in Queens. The old apartment where Elena had lived for so long was empty now. But the neighbor's kid, a teenage girl who used to see Elena carrying canvases up the stairs, had started painting. Too, she posted on social media, if someone like her can rise from the shadows, maybe I can too. One email came from a high school art teacher in Detroit. Professor Vasquez, your story gave my students hope. They think of you every time they pick up a brush. Another came from an elderly woman in Brazil. I used to believe I was too old to matter. Then I read about you. I picked up my paints again. Elena read each one carefully. Every message mattered. Meanwhile, Richard Whitmore's fall had been quick and brutal. The story had spread across social media like wildfire. Every media outlet, art magazine, and cultural blog picked it up. He tried to explain, tried to save face. Claimed he had discovered her, that it was all part of a publicity strategy. But no one believed him. The sponsors dropped him. His charity boards quietly removed him. Even his company's investors pushed him to resign, fearing reputational damage. His mansion, once filled with parties and fine art, was sold quietly to cover debt. Last anyone checked, he was living in a modest apartment in Long Island, just blocks away from where Elena had painted her masterpieces at night. No one called him for art advice anymore. Back at the museum, a quiet hush fell over the room as Elena prepared to speak. A journalist held out a recorder. Professor Vasquez, after all these years, what do you want the world to understand from your story? She thought for a moment, then spoke, simply, I want people to remember that no one's value is written on their clothes or their job. Title, you never know whose hands carry magic. Sometimes greatness walks in silence, but it always finds its voice again when the time is right. The room remained still for a beat, then came applause. Not loud, but deep real. Elena turned, gently wrapped her arm around her daughter's shoulders, and smiled. She wasn't just seen now, she was known, and she wasn't going anywhere.